Centaurs are pretty one-note in their D&D presentation, and frankly in media presentations more generally. They're almost always depicted as wandering, naturey nomads who have societies modelled after horse-riding cultures like the Mongols and the Scythians. They roam freely, use bows, wear hides and furs, and live in kind of steppe regions. Occasionally they can be found in forests in fantasy, but they're generally still hunter-gatherer nomads. Don't get me wrong, it is a solid presentation, and it holds up reasonably well to some scrutiny. But in my mind, to be honest, and as of D&D's latest versions, Centaurs are fey creatures. It's been that way since they were introduced as a player species in 2022. And seeing as it is Fey Week, an event where YouTubers around the D&D TTRPG spaces get together and discuss Fey-themed things in a massive week-long event with a huge playlist. Check out all the other stuff, by the way. I think it's high time we had a version of Centaur Society that benefits from their Fey connection, that evokes some of the interesting features of the Feywild, not solely relying and subsisting on dry, rocky, arid plains. And if a Centaur society ever wanted to move past a perpetually nomadic life, what would that look like? How would they farm? How would they build new homes? See, the problem with Centaurs is that they are among the most unfortunately designed of all of our fantasy creatures. And how difficult it is to get them to do anything, how badly their bodies function, is a real hard limit to some forms of civilizational progress. Horses are highly specialized creatures, and the horse body certainly limits the number of lifestyle options available to a centaur. As classically presented, the human torso on top of the front of a horse's body, a centaur can't even reach all the way down its own legs, let alone the hind legs, and let alone the floor. In fact, centaurs are stuck standing unless they choose to buckle all their knees and lie on the floor, which makes doing any work between 3 or 4 feet off the ground a real challenge. Centaurs are also massive and tall, and so adequately heating any home would be tough. Not to mention that while horses have eyes on the side of their head and are herbivores, centaurs, they have front-facing eyes, and presumably have some omnivorous anatomy too in their human torso. Furthermore, centaurs would be horrific at turning around. Not just because horse turning circles are kind of bad, but also because their torso is pretty much locked in place on jutting out the front of a horse. The only real rotational power they'd have is from back muscles, really, which will only get you halfway. So most centaurs would barely be able to see their own back, let alone actually adequately load it and place things upon it and use that back as in any load-bearing capacity at all. This, to me, is part of the problem with the general presentation of centaurs in fantasy as these wandering Mongol-style nomads. If we're looking at peripatetic wanderers, centaurs are legitimately some of the least capable creatures of packing up a camp and their possessions that I've ever seen. You're seriously expecting these guys to be able to put up or take down a tent? Even if they're only using tents or canvases in really extreme weather conditions. You expect proud, noble centaurs to load each other's backs with stuff? Or harness each other to wagons, because you can't harness yourself. Add to this the fact that horse feet are quite delicate. They're not really designed for anything other than grass or sand or mud. Anything else can wear through the hoof fast enough to cause massive long-term problems, especially if centaurs live longer than horses. Honestly, these deficiencies in basic biological design go a long way to explaining why centaurs are so often depicted as these naturey wanderers. It's just easier to imagine a guy who just carries all the stuff he ever needs with him and lives off the land than centaurs setting up any sort of permanent or even semi-permanent settlement, having to literally lie down to get a tent peg in, and then shuffle over to the next place and kneel down and lie down again. And that's why they tend to be stuck as a set of tribal nomads without any significant agriculture, settlements, or great works to their name. But it doesn't have to be that way. Sure, some centaurs may choose the nomadic lifestyle, but some will seek the comfort that other species have in civilization. The first problem we need to solve is the mobility one. Centaurs are likely to find interacting with things close to the ground difficult anyway, whether they have mobility or accessibility aids or not. The best aid we could possibly give centaurs as a civilization would probably be the billhook. Practically, centaurs are going to need a spiked pole for digging in the dirt, stabbing objects on the ground to pick them up, but it also would be good to have some sort of slicing blade to cut things, as well as a hooked implement to lift things up that they don't want to, just pierce on the end of a stick. Historical multiform polearms, like the billhook, would be commonplace, although perhaps cobbled together from more natural materials like claws, teeth, and bone. But honestly, I'm not sure that traditional soil-based farming would make much sense for a society of just centaurs anyway. They're still going to need their billhooks to access things on the ground, but using a long polearm to drill seeds and then finding some way to sow them in specific small spaces and also to trim and prune growing plants, it's all very low work and very difficult work, especially with a, maybe 5 or 6 foot long polearm. And so I'd expect that centaur diets would much rather be reliant on tall grasses and cereals and grains, as well as fruits and fungi and berries that grow at a more approachable level on or in trees, where they can actually use their human hands to grab them. It makes far more sense for centaur agriculture to all happen out of the reach of regular-sized people, in vast, well-tended orchards of trees, with the requisite 7 feet of clearance that as centaurs can wander safely underneath, plucking apples from their ever-growing orchard. Fungus growing up on the bark of trees, and apples, pears, all gathered in a basket, probably slung around the front of a centaur's torso. Because if you have it as a backpack or resting on your horse body, that's a lot of twisting, and you're probably dropping more fruit than you're actually collecting in your bag. But what about the horse's natural biological need to kind of always be moving about because of their really weird hearts? Or the fact that most normal building materials, especially things like flagstones, are just a bit too hard wearing on hooves that are unshoed especially. Or the massive heating issue with all of your buildings need to fit not just an entire horse, but also a human torso on top of it. Add that to Centaur's already established relative inability to work at a low level at that 3 foot range, and these guys just won't be building themselves shelter, right? But what if they grew it? We've already established our centaurs as competent and capable arborists, tending to their high-branched fruit trees and mosses and lichens and fungi growing on bark. Talented tree shapers in our real-world history have managed to achieve absolute wonders in the realms of topiary and grafting, and it stands to reason that with perhaps fey magic, or at least the massive natural abundance of the Feywild, centaurs might develop techniques that are equivalent to or far superior to our modern techniques. Planned forests, as an example, with a roof of intentionally interlocking canopies, arranged not in straight rows of trees, but in kind of chaotic curves and wide spirals, to allow centaurs to move around more effectively with their wide turning circle, never forcing them to take a right angle bend that's very sharp, but curving and maneuvering around. Also, these lengthened curved streets or alleys really underneath tree canopies that are woven together by magic or skill allow centaurs to constantly be on the move, helping their horse anatomy. They're constantly moving through this vast covered maze, clipping, tending, and grazing on their own twisted canopy roof as they go. A centaur colony like this would look more like a living labyrinth, with trees, climbers, and bushes constituting walls, and a soft moss and mud-filled floor. all shrouded in a sort of semi-darkness from filtering through the dappled canopy above. Through this grazing and constantly moving arborealism and wandering, Centaur society would play out less as an organised system, but as a series of social vignettes, running into another Centaur on the spiral and gardening with them for a while, or running into a large group of Centaurs, all focused on one big problem as they've all encountered the same problem, like a fallen tree or an invasive species. This wander through the great spiral forest would be a kind of meditative journey through nature, fixing and foraging as Centaurs move, eventually taking oneself back through the long, turning, twisting labyrinth to where the community lives and sleeps, bringing back the literal fruits of your labour in your front-mounted basket for those who haven't been able to make it out into the vast canopied maze, which is their home. This setup works largely because it really plays to the Centaur's strengths, reaching high branches, grazing and moving vast distances, the ability to digest all sorts of plant and some animal matter, and the skill that we can expect them to have with bows. Because shooting with a bow really needs your back muscles and a solid foundation. What's a more solid foundation than 4 legs? These long curving corridors really amplify their skill as excellent shots. These curving corridors and the maze-like labyrinth style also really mitigate Centaur's weaknesses. Large turning circles, the inability to reach down without lying down or using some form of aid, and their need to keep active and moving, while also providing cover from the elements, and a temperature that is kind of naturally regulated by this sort of terrarium that they've got set up, trapping all the heat inside their spirals. It also has the added benefit of making Centaurs really hard to attack. Flying foes must try to break and pull through carefully knotted upper branches to even get a look into this sort of canopic maze. And invaders on foot must negotiate soft, uneven ground and long, inefficient, curving corridors of trees. Or they can cut their way through thick, thorny underbrush to find their way to the centre of the maze, which would take a great deal of effort and probably draw a great deal of attention. All the while, Centaurs can be abusing their long, curved corridors for hit-and-run tactics with their bows, and use their speed, indefatigability, and knowledge of their traditional paths to warn other members of their herd before any creatures on foot even find a major pathway. If you want to take this notion even further, why not have multiple Centaur spirals in a broad ranging area to allow the soils in one spiral to regather its nutrients to avoid over-farming, for example. Although Centaur poo might help significantly with refertilizing the soil anyway. Then you can have multiple of these locations used by one herd, and migration cycles between them, perhaps with the seasons. So different fruits and produce is grown in each of their various seasonal dens. Herd migration from Centaur Circle to Centaur Circle, wherein they also get to train their battle skills every season, reclaiming their old forests from the goblins, the Ettercaps, and the Myconids, who may have moved in their absence. But you may not be happy with that as a solution for Centaur society. Clans of Centaurs constantly walking, grazing, and gardening through long curving alleys of trees. You may have been imagining a city-like civilization to rival the elves, dwarfs, not some four-legged labyrinth dwellers. So I've also got some ideas more in that vein of how a proper built-up settlement could be achieved by Centaur kind. Just generally some ideas to go on if you want to go down that route. First, no doors, or at least no door handles. Turning a handle to push open a door while going through with a horse's body is a logistical nightmare. Perhaps heavy leather flaps hanging from the top of door frames. Or saloon-style doors, they might work. Anything that can be pushed open from either side without breaking your stride, and that automatically closes again behind you, so you're not constantly having to go through a door and then turn your entire horse body round to then close that door behind you. It's also likely that shallow pools would be a common civic feature, perhaps with some deeper pools as well. Shallow ones would be a quick kind of walk-through hoof bath, probably with a bristly bottom or with long hooked sticks hanging nearby to get the gnarly bits out of your hoofs. Deeper pools would also be useful to clean the horsey half of your body. Perhaps they'd also have like bristle brushes nearby. Or better yet, a reasonably deep enough pool for a horse to swim or stand in it, while also having a sort of waterfall so that centaurs can wash their top half too. As for constructing buildings, I think a centaur city would start construction, paradoxically, by digging down multiple feet into the ground. Perhaps in a way that's aided by magic or softer ground generally, before then laying some foundations on a semi-subterranean floor. This is because digging with long poled instruments or special, spade-like hoof attachments is a lot easier than building with brick and mortar on the floor by kneeling down. It's fairly imaginable just a slightly longer version of a spade could be easily usable by a centaur. So dig down those first 3 or 4 feet, then use that as your foundation to build at a level that's accessible from a centaur's arms. They'd probably also be looking for ground that's compatible with that style of building, that isn't going to leach water into their homes through groundwater, for example. This also has the added benefit of semi-solving your heating issue. These houses are going to be well insulated on their ground level, and also protrude less high into open air, and so there's less heat loss going on there too. We'd also see ramps everywhere down into their homes and perhaps to access grand buildings, because stairs are really fiddly for horses and ladders are impossible for a centaur. Sleep would probably be had on cushioned, softened floors, although options like a hammock for the horse undercarriage may be interesting. Or we could see the horse half kneeling on something soft, while the human half has a shelf where their arms and their head can easily rest on a cushioned surface as well. As for farming, we'd be looking at a few different options. Either centaurs domesticate wild grasses, like barley and wheat, relying on the height of those once grown to process and harvest them at arm level, or they'd employ some form of vertical farming, perhaps steep irrigated notches cut out of local hillsides so that they can reach across with their arms to gather things from these quite steep notches, or trellis or shelf farming on the sunward sides of their homes. Orchards, as discussed earlier, are also quite a good idea. We'd probably see a mix of all 3 styles. Hard paving stones would be rare and uncomfortable, with mud, sand or grass more normal for most thoroughfares. And we may see centaurs domesticate or tame creatures like large dogs or birds to help with grabbing things from the ground. I quite like the idea of centaurs being the first species to tame wolves and invent fetch as a practical way to ease the frustration and vulnerability that comes with entirely lying your whole body down to grab something off the floor. If you take everything from this second set of proposals, you get quite an interesting place indeed. Wide, sanded thoroughfares with regular aqueducts running along them for foot washing. Surprisingly squat houses, just maybe 6 or 7 feet taller than ground level, possibly with flat roofs, so that a centaur standing on the raised sandy thoroughfare could see across the roof of their homes, past the roof of their homes, enhancing their visual range and enabling them to see not just their neighbours, but threats coming from far afield. It also increases the feeling of openness in this space, which I think would be important for centaur society. This civilization likely works best in arid environments with a slightly more clay-based soil, by the way. Perhaps we'd see every street or home dedicated to trellises of edible plants for grazing. The hills around may even be filled with these steep notches where staple crops are grown, and the city may be ringed with tall farmed grasses and grains instead of walls. These grains, by the way, engineered to be slightly too high for non-centaurs to see over, but permitting wide-ranging views and vast open space, at least the feeling of it, for the centaurs of this city. Open ranges that centaurs could easily run and shoot in if ever attacked. Instead of walls, you've got these vast forests of grain. Communal covered baths may sit at key points with those waterfalls we mentioned earlier. And we might also see arenas, wide, broad arenas set aside for sports, like similar to hurling or polo or archery. A centaur city would be flat, sprawling, and may even look from above like a gigantic, strange crop circle, especially if centaurs decide to grow their grasses not just in an outer ring around themselves, but on their roofs and in some of their major thoroughfares, on the sides of some of their major thoroughfares. And it would look especially like a giant crop circle from above if they used the grasses and straws from the waste of these wheats and barleys to line their streets, instead of sand, to have a soft surface for their hooves. So there you have it. Multiple civilizational concepts in which centaurs, some of the least practically designed creatures in fantasy, could live, thrive, and survive in a coordinated settler civilization, with some nods to their heritage as intelligent, noble creatures, and with a touch of the Fae. Speaking of the Fae, make sure to check out some of the other wonderful videos in this week's event, the playlist of which is linked, but all of your favourite D&D style creators, TTRPG creators, they're going to be in on this. And also check back in with this channel tomorrow for an extra live stream, a Fae Week special where we'll be doing exactly what I've just done in this video for Centaurs, designing a civilizational plan for the Bullywug, a froggy Fae creature. That livestream will also be available after the fact if you are a YouTube member of this channel, as are all my past live streams as well. You also get my videos as early as I can make them available, and priority replies in comments, access to my members only Discord as well. But that's enough of that. Enjoy Fae Week. I hope to see you in my live stream tomorrow. And with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.